So hello, everyone. I'm Dominic Manno from Alamos National Lab. I lead our storage research team in the HPC division. First and foremost, I'd like to thank the working group for having me speak today. We are members of the working group, but it is certainly one of my goals to become more active going forward. So I think this is kind of a great starting point for that. And then there were some questions sent out ahead of time that I've listed at the very end. But if something comes up during the talk, feel free to interrupt me and we can have a chat. So today I'll walk through our work in computational storage implementation and our ongoing efforts. We've been sharing a lot of these details in various forums and probably even directly with some of the vendors in the audience. So some of it might be a repeat for some of you, and apologies for that. But with that being said, let's jump right in. Okay, so as I mentioned, our talk will be focused on the vision of computational storage for simulation science. We certainly think there's an overlap with industry and cloud, especially as I move into some of the data analytics use cases. And it's always been one of our main goals is to kind of use and contribute to open source implementations, upstream any modifications, and leverage the broader community, especially as we all navigate kind of the early days of CS. So just quickly starting off with a brief background on the current generation system. This is Trinity. So Trinity is based on a Haswell and KNL CPU. There's kind of a mix of both CPUs, about half and half. Approximately 20,000 compute nodes, resulting in a few million cores, 2 petabytes of DRAM. There is a 4 petabyte all flash burst buffer, which provides approximately 4 terabytes a second of performance. And then moving down kind of through the tiers of storage from hot to cold, there's approximately 100 petabytes of what we call Scratch. That's a luster-based, disk-based solution. Approximately about a terabyte per second there. And then campaign storage is LANL's basically capacity storage tier. It's highly protected. Data is expected to live there for months to kind of exist across multiple computing campaigns, which is the name campaign storage comes from. So not too high performant there, but very reliable and certainly faster than an archive. And then obviously stuff that lands in tape is kind of a forever model there, and tape is relatively slow in our deployments. So these sizes aren't quite tier 1 sized, but the unique thing of LANL is we're basically simulating a handful of jobs or types of jobs that can run for many months, and a campaign can last up to a year or two. And it's generating petabyte size files and hundreds of petabyte size data sets across the life of a campaign for approximately one user or a small handful of users that exist on the team. I think that's all I wanted to cover. Oh, I guess as we kind of move on into the future, we expect these numbers to grow. Although for 2023 system crossroads, the size of memory may not grow at the same scale as it was before because we're switching to HBM. So the capacity difference there is, the cost per capacity difference there is pretty big. But yeah, let's continue. So just kind of an overview of what we'll talk about today and our method to experimenting with computational storage for simulation science. The traditional crawl, walk, run phase. So we started with what we call ABOF1. I'll describe what that means here in a bit. As a partnership between multiple companies, Adedicom, as many of you are aware of their work, Aon, and NVIDIA, and SK Hynix. And this is for sort of what I call data agnostic operations. So we don't care what the payload is. We're just going to operate on the data. And these are standard storage functions that a file system commonly operates. And then as kind of move down the stack here, we become more data aware. The first step was a simple application. It's a record-oriented format with a small query space. So think single dimension query space, something that's kind of pretty easy to generate a layout for, especially if you map it to something like key value. And then I'll talk about what we're thinking about now, which is sort of the most complex case, which is something that's format aware, but for column-oriented applications, which are very complex in how they lay out their data in memory, and thus how they lay it out in storage. And then how they'll query that data also becomes quite a bit more complex than the key value case. And then finally, we'll close with some work we've done in the campaign storage tier of if we wanted to do analytics in a disk-based platform, what are some of the gotchas that we want to explore in that space? All right, so our first use case was developed to help us understand what it takes to deploy a highly efficient all flash-based storage endpoint. We refer to this effort as the accelerated box of flash. That's kind of where the acronym ABOF comes from. And as I mentioned, this is a partnership between multiple companies and LANL, and we're operating on data agnostic, the data we're operating on is, we don't care what the formats are or what's inside the payload. We're just going to do some storage system operations on them. Okay, so starting with the current generation of HPC storage design, the large cluster on the left kind of represents what Trinity would be. Built to support mission critical applications. Like I mentioned before, a single job can consume the bulk of the compute nodes. The simulation itself is super high entropy. The values are all floating point values in our simulations. These are things like temperature, pressure, momentum. These simulations run for multiple months. And in order to kind of ensure forward progress, there's a phenomenon called checkpointing. Most of you are probably aware of this, but you basically checkpoint periodically to ensure that the simulation is continuing progress. So during that checkpoint, you're basically dumping the state of memory, or about 80% of the state of memory, to a persistent storage tier. And so you can't be computing while you're writing that data out, because you need to have a saved state of it, a known good state. So during that IO phase, simulation is paused. Thus, we're not making forward progress in the simulation. So we want that phase to go as fast as possible. Hence the enumeration with all flash storage. What else about this? So if we move out towards the right, these little, I hope you can see my mouse here. Maybe I can switch to a laser pointer. Maybe I can't, but hopefully you can see my mouse. These orange boxes with the storage symbols are what we refer to as the burst buffer. So these are dedicated servers with flash installed, and they sit on the same high-speed fabric as the compute nodes. At the time Trinity was purchased, we were able to afford approximately 4 petabytes of flash, and that yielded about 4 terabytes a second of bandwidth. So due to the capacity and the expected data lifetime in this tier, we don't provide any data protection there. And due to the small capacity and the first implementation of a burst buffer, we kind of hedged our bets and decided to also deploy a high performant disk tier. This is represented out on the far right, the Lustre setup we've described in the diagram. And so we want to provide a minimum of 1 terabyte per second of bandwidth to the Lustre tier. That way we can kind of drain the burst buffer effectively. And when you buy disks for bandwidth, you end up with a very, very large capacity. So I think this is on the order of 100 petabytes. It was probably the last disk-based high bandwidth tier we would buy based on current economics. And so that's kind of the summary of all this. But the biggest takeaway from the diagram that I kind of want to get across here is that the design of both the burst buffer and the Lustre storage system is the tight coupling between storage media and storage servers. So it's a super rigid design, doesn't lend itself nicely to any augmentation or modification, even if it's a temporary modification for trials of different workloads and things like that. So if we start thinking about how we want to design for the future, and current economics of flash dropping since Trinity was purchased, and then NVMe and NVMe over fabrics, kind of modernization, or not modernization, but standardization efforts, we realized that we can accommodate multiple workload requirements, not just this high throughput workload requirement that we have, even though it is the most important one. And we can do so with really the exact same hardware. And then we can kind of scale those file system services separately from the media. So we can buy our media based on workload requirements, and then add servers as those workloads are being run on the system. I got a little bit of an echo there. Okay, there it goes away. It went away. Okay, so we've lost the monolithic rigid design. We've got rid of that, and we can basically spin up any new storage system software we want on these storage services, on these storage service nodes. I've listed them as PFS servers, but they technically don't have to be parallel file system servers. But we can deploy the same stable parallel file system that we use for checkpoint needs. And then we can also start exploring more specialized software stack, something that can kind of expose the IOPS of the devices, or when PMEM was the thing, we could expose like a PMEM connector or something like that. But yeah, so the takeaway here is each service can now meet a workload and it can do it efficiently. There are some alternatives to this that others in the industry have explored, like hyperconverged architectures, or just deploying dedicated islands of storage for each workload. There are pros and cons of each. Dedicated islands obviously become costly, and then hyperconverged doesn't really suit our workload needs, but certainly some sites can take advantage of that. And then I think the last point to make here is either you can expose the media to storage service servers, or you can actually expose directly to the clients. There's some security implications that probably need to be ironed out, but the technology is there to expose those that media directly into the compute cluster. Okay, so that's background on NVMe and Flash and how they're impacting our designs, but I'm supposed to be focusing on computational storage. So as it turns out, just pairing Flash with storage server and current HPC file system stacks doesn't really achieve the levels of performance that the Flash devices are capable of. So we're putting a pretty heavy investment in the Flash. We want to make sure that we're extracting the performance, and I'll probably refer to this as storage server efficiency throughout this talk. Some folks get a little antsy with the term efficiency, but that's what I mean there, is extracting all of the bandwidth and IOPS out of the devices that we've purchased. So it turns out that RAID and compression techniques that we use create the need for multiple passes over the data in memory. I think there's been a few talks about this now at either FMS or SDC. So we certainly have seen the same phenomena as others. And so this is true today. It won't always be true as memory, such as HBM comes out or other future memory technologies come out. We might not see a need for this, but as today's storage servers exist, this is certainly a limitation. So when we began testing with all flash file systems, we realized that this limitation existed. And to make matters worse, as I mentioned, we're buying flash to meet bandwidth requirements and less or so IOPS, but it generally means we don't have a ton of capacity in this tier, especially when you compare it to something like disks. And we're not buying it for the capacity, but we certainly have a bare minimum capacity we need. So that kind of adds the complexity that any space savings we can get, we certainly need. So that's why we're interested in compression. But to kind of put the cherry on top here, the physics simulations, the idea here is high entropy and floating point values. So the stuff actually doesn't compress all that well. And if you really want to get good compression ratios, you need something like gzip. So now we've introduced something that's even slower in the pipeline. And so these plots kind of describe that. I think we've presented these a few times, but I'll quickly run through them. So the two diagrams depict two different memory or two different CPUs with different memory controller implementations. We actually have a version with the first generation EPYC, and it's a little confusing and even worse. But if you just look at these two comparisons, so if we look at the raw NVMe bandwidth, that's that kind of dashed line at the top. This is for 10 disks, so an 8+1 and an 8+2. So that dashed line is kind of the target. The first solid line at the top, so the dark blue and the dark green, is just adding a little bit of computation into the pipeline. So we're just going to do a checksum. I think this is a Fletcher in ZFS, so it's a lightweight checksum. So we're adding a little bit of computation, but we see a pretty decent drop in performance on the EPYC, less so in the Platinum, but still. And then as we move down the shades, we add more computation. So first RAID Z1, second RAID Z2. So we're adding extra data protection, which requires a little bit more computation. And between those two, you don't see a big difference in performance. And as it turns out, we expect that to map to the number of times you have to pass over memory. And so if you add compression to this line, whether it be LZ or gzip, the performance is significantly dropped. I think LZ can achieve just under RAID Z2 performance, but gzip is certainly in the hundreds of megabytes a second of performance. And this is just due to the gzip algorithm and how many times tests go over memory. So this is kind of our capstone of why we think that there is memory bandwidth limitation in the storage servers, especially when you compare it to the available bandwidth in the NIC and the available bandwidth across 10 or 24 NVMe drives. Okay, so as we look through what our requirements are for designing an efficient, usable storage endpoint, we certainly want to require parallel file system support. There's probably going to be millions of processes writing and reading either a single parallel file or multiple files. So to accomplish this, we've used Lustre, so we're going to kind of stick with Lustre as the base parallel file system. And then Lustre has multiple backing stores. ZFS is a open source file system that we use to deploy underneath Lustre. We use it in multiple tiers, so it was kind of our go-to for this use case. The next point that the next requirement we had was the flexibility to where we run what, I guess is how I'll phrase that. So think about if you want to do erasure coding, checksumming, compression and decompression. You'd like to be able to do that in the CPU that's running ZFS or in an enclosure that has a DPU or in an enclosure that has a CSA or a CSD or a CSP. Just so that way, if there are changing economics, we can kind of move what is running where. And this was one of the most difficult challenges when we first started exploring the space, is trying to decide the optimal placement of offloads. Obviously, we wanted to follow the emerging computational storage standard. We wanted to make use of something like peer-to-peer, although this current generation of implementation doesn't include peer-to-peer. And then something that's kind of broadly usable, which is another reason we chose ZFS. So what are some benefits we expect by using a computational storage approach and offloading these high-intensive memory bandwidth operations? We expect by using gzip, we will get a compression rate improvement from about 1.05 to 1 to about 1.3 to 1, so a pretty significant improvement for scientific data compression. We can start exploring higher protection schemes if that's something that we're interested in the future, so that way the calculating the parity doesn't, or the regenerating parity doesn't cost us as much by forcing the CPU to do it. We expect higher per server and per device bandwidth, so kind of getting back to that efficiency notion that I mentioned before. And then because we're decoupling the media and the storage servers, we can buy less servers and really impedance match the number of servers we have to the available bandwidth of the media. And then lastly, this will become more clear in the next slide or two, but enable more than just a block-only interface. So we don't want to hide all of the operations behind block. That makes it difficult for file systems to understand, especially when you deal with something like compression. So we really want to make sure that the file system can basically do some distributed heterogeneous programming by using device memory rather than just sending blocks out to a device and kind of not knowing what's happening to them. So there's multiple components within the ABOF. We decided to kind of try to explore all the permutations of available offloads. So the ABOF has well, I guess I'll go back here. A DPU, so it's a BlueField-2 based enclosure. We've also built one that is an ARM-based CPU enclosure. But we also have slots for FPGAs. So this is more of like a CSA, I guess, or a CSP really. And then we also have some U.2 form factor CSPs. And then we didn't actually deploy CSDs in this box, but there's nothing that would prevent you from doing so. So now the software layers, there were kind of two main contributions in this space. So first we had to modify ZFS to allow for offloads. So we called this the ZFS interface for accelerators. It's really slight modification, so that way the ZFS file system can talk to a kernel module and understand what offloads are available and sort of tell those offloads how to call into the ZFS functions. This way, an implementer of an offload wouldn't have to understand the internals of ZFS and modify it themselves. And that second piece is that kernel module I just referenced. We call that DPU services module. And that kind of just allows what we call providers to register their functions and map them to the ZFS style functions that we've defined in ZFS. And so this is kind of the notional fixed function offloads in ZFS. So the top kind of represents the traditional ZFS pipeline, and the bottom introduces how we want to accelerate. The main thing to kind of take away here is that we can offload as many of these as we want. We can turn them on and off at will, and ZFS still functions properly. Although the most efficient case is obviously offloading everything, because you can kind of reuse buffers in an accelerator if it has all of the functions available. And so this goes all the way out to issuing the IO, trying to prevent those extra memory copies from the host CPU to back and forth from the host CPU to devices. How am I doing on time? Yeah, I need to go quicker. Okay, so any questions about the ABOF work or any of the specifics there? There were quite a few talks at SDC about this, so I didn't want to provide too much detail here, but I'm happy to answer questions if there are any about it. Okay, great. So that sort of summarizes our crawl stage. We're obviously still working to improve performance and incorporate things like peer-to-peer NVMe and new hardware, all of this stuff that should make us go faster. So we want to make sure that we can still provide high throughput checkpoints and doing so in an efficient manner. But if we want to start exploring other workloads, it turns out there are some analysis workloads done in simulation science that are done pretty inefficiently today. And so at LANL, we focused on two main types of simulations. First is a particle simulation application. This is depicted here with this picture. It's a plasma study. And so we chose this one because it was record-oriented data. It was mapped very nicely to key value. There's particle IDs and then a small number of data fields that fit super nicely with key value. So the data arrangement is very simple compared to the complex mesh-based applications I'll describe later. So the application at LANL that does this is called VPIC, the Vector Particle and Cell Code. So this is an MPI code that can scale up to hundreds of thousands of processes. It's a fixed mesh, so the mesh doesn't change throughout the simulation, but rather the particles move throughout the mesh across time steps. So a record consists of basically approximately 32 to 64 byte particles. This is a particle ID, and then a cell ID, and then energy, and a few other momentum is calculated based on a few of the other fields. So the particles move around frequently between processes. There can be millions of particles per node and trillions of particles in a large simulation. But the key takeaway when we talked to the VPIC scientists was they're actually only interested in a very, very tiny subset of the particles. So an example query that they described to us was select some values from all of the particles where the energy is greater than a large value. And it turns out that really less than 1%, and then certainly less than 0.5% needs to be read from the storage. But the current model they used to do this analysis was read all of the data back into memory, sort it on the interested field, select the values they want, and then repeat this process for multiple fields that are of interest. So very inefficient, very resource intensive. You've got to basically run at the same scale as the simulation was originally ran because you've got to fit all of this data in memory. And then I think the last point to take away here is that this analysis is always done, it's pretty obvious, but the analysis is always done after the simulation either completes or completes a time step. So you kind of need the full corpus of data to do these interesting, or these queries of interest. What else do I want to say about this? Yeah, I think I covered everything here. This is just really the same information, yeah. Okay, so looking at existing solutions to help solve our problem. Things like post-processing, in-transit processing, and in-situ processing all exist. They're all useful in their own right for certain scenarios. But when you compare them to something like computational storage, there's quite a few shortfalls in each of these. So if you want to do post-processing, read all of the data using a different resource, there's quite a bit of excessive data movement. You're going to have to still shuffle that petabyte-sized data set to some other location that you're going to calculate indexes on. So that's no good. If you want to do in-transit processing, this requires additional compute nodes and additional memory. So you start constraining the size of your simulation based on how much you want to index. And then in situ processing is useful. It's just a little bit lightweight, so you can maybe only produce indexes on one or a few columns that may be of interest. So a less granular index capability. So as I mentioned, that this kind of represents the trade space in the current current query capabilities. But when we start thinking about computational storage, we can probably overcome all or most of these limitations in existing processes. So we began work with Carnegie Mellon to explore doing so using a software approach. This is called DeltaFS. I'm not going to do DeltaFS justice in this one slide, so if you're interested, please read the papers. But given the constraints mentioned previously, we don't have many extra compute nodes, and the available memory on each compute node is really non-existent. The simulations may use up to 90% or so of the memory. So we take the resources we're able to, and we do some indexing using DeltaFS and LevelDB, or our key value store. But so effectively, what DeltaFS did was it made the application believe that it was writing and or reading from one file, which it was writing out trillions of particles. But what it was really doing under the covers was writing records to a massively parallel distributed sharded particle ID-based key value store. And so it achieves somewhere on the order of 8 billion particles or operations per second. So super high performance, increasing approximately 1,000 times the performance of just doing the sort method. And as simulation size grows, query time stays about the same. That's what that graph on the right depicts. The graph on the left depicts what our overhead is by introducing the indexing. So because the simulation obviously without indexing is going to run at a fixed runtime, by adding the indexing, we've only introduced something like 10% in the knee of the curve, and then on the top end about 30% of extra overhead in actual runtime. So this was kind of the capstone to say, yes, moving to something like key value is very helpful, but there's still excessive data movement going on in this process. And so we want to become less reliant on the large storage space, but we also want to decrease the data movement, which is where computational storage comes in. So we started this work with SK Hynix, and we initially started with a standard KV API. But for scientific simulation, we really need a few more operations and some more fine-grained control than what was defined in the current API. So this is partly an effect of the specific workload that we want to offload. So we wrote up what we consider an extended API or extended requirements for scientific key value. And this was kind of a starting point for operations we thought would suffice, and we began working from there. I can certainly share that with anyone interested. We have a link to a public web page where that's being shared. But yeah, to quickly run through some of these things. So on data insert, we thought bulk put was an important feature just to kind of achieve the performance when inserting. And then on read, point queries are great, but range queries are even more important for the types of queries that we want to execute. So range queries were a must, which sort of meant secondary indexes became a must. And then adding some histogram capability to help with some lightweight indexing. And then in terms of management, because of the nature of the simulation phases, we want to control compaction. We don't want compaction to interfere with new writes that are coming in. And then also sort of serializing data out of the key value store and preserving the indexes was another important feature to us. Okay, so in our proof of concept, in order to KV store was implemented in an accelerator. This accelerator is connected directly to a zone namespace SSD. As I mentioned before, the KV supports primary indexing, important for port queries, and secondary indexing histogram capabilities for range queries. What else here? So this certainly led to some very efficient range queries that are important for scientific queries, and very efficient or very inefficient to implement if you try to build them on top of something like a hash-based KV that only does point queries. There's not a big win by implementing secondary indexes on top of something like that. So in our early results, super promising when we compare to a software implementation like LevelDB. And since these results were published, we've seen quite a bit further improvements in both the write and the query phase, and those should be published in a paper venue fairly shortly, I think. I can share that information once we submit for publication. So to kind of conclude the key value case, we still care about full bandwidth checkpointing. That matters quite a bit. But if we're going to leverage the design of NVMe and NVMe over fabrics, we also want to be able to handle these massive amounts of small objects and super highly selective queries. Those are becoming critical, and we want to make sure that we support those. So obviously it leads to more diverse storage abstractions and certainly another kind of feather in the cap for computational storage. Okay, our last topic here will be ABOF 2.0 plans. So this is kind of continuing the work we've already done with those partners, maybe adding a few more partners. But to do a data-aware offload for our complex applications. So these are column-oriented in nature rather than record. They're multidimensional, and queries will want to be able to query in multi-dimensions. So it's quite big, complex, pretty difficult to shard. So we'll run through that. I guess I'll caveat all of this with this is our least defined use case. We're sort of still out in the weeds trying to figure out exactly what we want to do in this space. But I think we've gotten a decent grasp on at least the path forward. So many and most continuum-oriented simulations are multi-dimensions in space, so one-dimensional, two-dimensional, or three-dimensional. Multi-dimensional in time, so across time steps. Querying across time steps is very important to the scientists in this use case. And then they often query the data produced by these applications, the data produced by these applications can often have 2 to 5, maybe even more dimensions of variables. So beyond space and time, we're adding dimensions like temperature, pressure, energy, momentum, material properties, other things like that. So we're creating quite a bit of join space when you think about all of the dimensions that want to be queried across. And so some simple things some simple queries that we got from the user base was tracking a shock wave through a material, or tracking a formation of an eddy, which quite is not that simple. I think I have an example of that on the next slide. But single time steps are petabytes that are distributed across many cores and address spaces. So pretty difficult to kind of wrap your head around exactly the best way to implement this capability. So oftentimes the applications use squares or cubes or other geometric forms, probably a polyhedral of some kind, as the cell in which a value saves the state. So these are all saved in arrays. And so there are multiple mesh refinements. So adaptive mesh refinement, or AMR, allows scientists to run larger problems that fit in memory at full resolution. And as the resolution changes, the mesh kind of deforms. And that's this picture here in the center. So not all of the shapes are the same size or even the same shape because this mesh is deforming. Eulerian is a little bit simpler. That's depicted down here on the bottom right. So the mesh refines and it becomes more refined in the interesting points, but the shapes don't change, just the size. Okay, what else here? So the application has to store all of this information in sort of like a compact map that describes how you serialize these distributed arrays and how they're laid out across the dimensions of space and how they're laid out across processes. So what's often used is the concept of Hilbert space filling. And this kind of helps them lay out a serial view of a 2 or 3 dimensional space. So what the diagram here depicts is time steps in a simulation and how the cells might be distributed across processes and or machines. So in the top picture, or sorry, that represents the top picture. In the bottom picture here is a series of boxes with cells. Each box depicts really in two-dimensional, very simplified version of this, processes and machines, its cells, and how state array variables are laid out. The lower picture also depicts how there's an overall serial map of the state space across all partitioning processes and nodes. So this kind of describes what the Hilbert order is. And so every time step, the data will be serialized out of the nodes that are participating in the simulation and written out to storage. Usually it's in a single parallel file, and it kind of looks columnar if you think about it logically, and multiple variables are stored in the global Hilbert order. But really what's happening under the covers in the storage system is the data is being chunked up and distributed across multiple storage servers, multiple storage devices. And so as we think about the concept of changing the way apps write the data, so whether it's logically and we can build mapping functions, it kind of maps, let me switch slides here. It kind of maps nicely to something like Parquet or multiple Parquet files. And so as you can see, each variable ends up being its own column. And for every column, there's a simple min and max index for a row group, and there might be a total min max description for the min and max for all of the variables in an entire Parquet file. So that's kind of our thinking is, how can we map this already columnar output into something like Parquet? So if we get the data written out in Parquet/columnar format with some sort of manifest information that describes where files are and how they map to the global Hilbert space, then we want to add some, or probably add some percentile estimation information for every variable that is of interest. That way we can sort of even further reduce the data that we're interested in. If we haven't built a percentile on a variable that we think will be queried upon, you can kind of ignore that entire set of data. Oh, not yet. Okay. Let's see, what else did I want to say about this? So as we began to explore exactly how we're going to offload these queries into devices or arrays of computational storage arrays, it becomes quite complex. So what we're exploring right now are KD trees. So KD trees are very good at building expensive but reusable indices. So we're certainly interested in KD trees. But we also want to make sure that we're reducing the data before we build something expensive like a KD tree. So if we know that only 5 variables are going to be of interest, we want to make sure that we're only building indexes across those 5 variables. We also want to make sure that we're laying data out appropriately for erasure coding. So that's another challenge in this space. And then finally, we want to be able to apply things like compression and checksumming as well. So quite complex. I don't think we've got a full map forward of exactly how we want to proceed. We've got quite a few technologies that we're interested in exploring for this space, but this kind of represents the general idea of what we're trying to do. Okay, and then finally, we'll close with some work we've done with Seagate, is mapping this column-oriented concept to a disk-based storage system. So basically reusing the Parquet format, but on disk. And so disk brings its own challenges to how you access the data. It's not as agile as Flash when we can do just very small accesses to check for indices. But we certainly want to make sure that, like the previous case, we're using standard analytics tools like DuckDB or Apache Drill. That way, the scientists don't have to learn some custom query interface. They can leverage existing tools that are well supported. I think I'll get to this in a second, but one of the complexities with doing this at the disk level and when you bring erasure coding in is alignment. So aligning data properly so that way each device can see data or each device has the exact amount of data it needs to be able to query on. So something like a Parquet row group or a page size. So we've worked on a prototype implementation using Seagate's Kinetic platform, which is a hard drive with an Envoy card attached to it. Our current prototype exposes the drives as NVMe over Fabric devices, but longer term, we'd like to leverage the Kinetic's key value interface. So this is very, very prototypey because what we're doing is violating file system layers. So we've built a stripped down version of ZDB, which is a tool that allows you to kind of dig under the covers of ZFS and look at file and LBA mappings. So we were able to map ZFS file names to disk LBAs to kind of build that manifest that I described before. And then custom C++ code is running on the Envoy cards to do in-drive analytics. So for that campaign storage tier, data is being written through the file system as it normally would, but the analytics path kind of digs under the covers and goes directly into ZFS and talks to the devices directly. So this has been a very good learning experience for us. We understand that this isn't a sustainable model for a production deployment, but we're kind of marching down the path to figure out exactly the best way to implement such a thing. Okay, I'm doing better on time now. Okay, I guess I'll let any other questions come in that folks have. Otherwise, I can jump to the questions that were sent ahead of time.
Okay, I have a question.
Yeah.
Do you think you could use a computational storage device that wasn't key value?
So yes, I think there's difficulties with it in this case, where if we do so, there's going to be some sort of a layer violation unless we build on top of the file system or build into the file system. But I don't think there's anything forcing key value other than in that first use case I described, the format maps very nicely. And then in the columnar oriented format, I don't think we need key value there. We probably need something more like object.
So if there was a metadata associated with the value, would that enhance your use case?
Metadata associated with it. So
like MIME type. So if there was a MIME type available for the value, would that help?
But it would still be a block-based storage device?
Well, the key value isn't necessarily block oriented, right?
Oh, sorry. I thought you were comparing key value to something else.
Yeah, key value plus metadata. I'm wondering.
Oh, key value plus metadata. Okay. That's interesting. I'd have to think about that.
Okay.
That could be helpful. It would certainly.
I mean, you can do that with existing key values just by, extending how you use the key space, right? You can have base keys and then have all the metadata you want as, suffix version to that key value, right?
Right, and we've certainly done that is kind of build or encode information into the key, right? Yeah. Right.
That's the other approach, is to actually, put your metadata in the key itself and use range operations to find your keys.
Yeah, if you're searching through a drive for JPEGs, you want to find all the JPEGs, but you don't want to have to fetch every value to find out if it's a JPEG or not,
Correct, but you can, with ordered key values, you can do range ops depending upon how you order your keys,
Sure.
so that you can find that stuff with just searching the key space.
And for performance, you're comparing key value to a RocksDB that was on a block storage, right?
Correct. Yes.
Yeah. So you didn't compare it to RocksDB on a key value drive.
Correct. The same feature limitations exist, but you're right. There would be some performance differences there. Yep.
Thank you.
Hi, Philip. Nice to hear from you.
Hey.
Just talked to you yesterday. Yeah, and I guess I'll also note all of this this was a ton of information to cram into 45 minutes, so I'm very happy to go into more detail on any of this with folks offline or in future meetings. Okay, let's start running through some of these. So security model for computational storage use. Data agnostic use cases occur mostly in the kernel because we have a file system involved. So I'm not really going to focus on security there. But in the data analytics use case, it's quite a bit more complex. Like I mentioned at the very beginning, in a perfect world, we can expose something like a key value or an object-based namespace, that has CS programs all the way out to user space. But that obviously presents a security challenge. I've been trying to follow the key per IO work a little bit. My gut feeling is that might be a little bit overkill. So I'm not sure if there's a happy medium approach somewhere in there. There's certainly many ways to do it. I haven't explored them all, and I probably need to understand the options a little bit better.
So for your particular use case, are you focused so much on a single user that you do not worry about security in your current implementation?
In all of these prototypes, yes, that is absolutely what we've been doing. As we think about moving into production, we would have to think about security in a more serious way. Yep. Okay, so multi-tenant environment. This kind of goes hand in hand with the previous question, I guess. I kind of took the question both ways. In multi-tenants with respect to multiple CS programs, obviously we're all for that. We've been super careful in developing our file system and kernel modules to allow for a plugin model to kind of accommodate that. But multi-tenants with respect to users, I think it kind of maybe maps back to some of the security comments I had before. And there's a ton of exploration to do there. There was a question about architecture and API documents. I'm happy to maybe discuss that in a working group meeting. I'm not completely familiar with all of the SNIA documents. I am a little bit more up to date on the NVMe spec itself, so I don't have much feedback in the way of the API documents that exist today. So it would be helpful, or what features are we looking for that we would like standardized? So maybe not a specific feature, but something that we think will be challenging eventually is exposing namespaces directly to clients. So in extreme cases, as I mentioned, something like 10 or 20,000 initiators to a single target. That seems potentially problematic for the scaling of the way that state is tracked. And then secondarily, obviously, all of our simulations are floating point values. So I realized that eBPF was originally one of the primary CS implementation schemes. I realize that's potentially been paused as a language of choice, but we certainly want floating point support in whatever CS programs are implemented. And then I guess the extreme case is just running a Linux on all of the CS devices. So kind of a large trade space there. Any follow-ups there? Okay. So additional technologies such as CXL, what is on the horizon, and allocation of memory. So something akin to shared memory, especially for the data analytics use case, seems like a big win. It seems to become important when you consider an operation that requires some intermediate results that need to be stored and needing to be operated on for multiple locations. And actually CXL seems to be a good match here, although it adds quite a bit of complexity to the design. And then another comment that's come up with some of our partners is that streaming data models should be kind of looked at more closely. So right now, everything's pretty heavily focused on memory-centric offloads, but if we looked at a streaming model where the data can be streamed in directly from storage to an accelerator and then back out to a target, and letting the accelerator can do buffering or just directly operate on the data. I think there's there's also quite a bit of complexity in that, but it's certainly something to think about in this space. Training of commands.
So
Yep.
Focusing a little bit more on that one.
Yep.
What do you see as the use cases for passing data between computational storage nodes? In other words, you have sharded data or data that's spread across multiple nodes. Do you see a need or desire to have one node that processes a piece of data, passes that output to another node, but then does further processing on that data in combination with data that exists on that node?
Yeah, I think that would be extremely powerful, especially when you think about the scale at which some of these storage systems are. So we've got multiple enclosures that each store a segment of the data. And if we're querying across all of those devices, it does seem important to be able to do some piece of the calculation on each one for performance reasons, but also be able to then combine them into a single answer. Yep.
And do you see CXL as a means to share that data?
That seems like maybe the natural progression, right? Is that CXL can kind of enable this fairly easily. I'm probably hand waving away a lot of complexity that it adds, but it at least seems like a good fit.
Thank you.
All right, so chaining of commands. I certainly believe that the CS implementers know better than I do, but reducing memory copies and in pipelining operations certainly seems like a big win. I think this is possible even if it's not standardized, but yeah, I think that there could be a big win there with chaining. And then challenges implementing CS. I hopefully was able to describe a lot of those challenges throughout the talk. But I would say that an early challenge was obviously understanding everything and kind of getting our team up to speed on a lot of complex topics. But one of the technical challenges was where to place each offload. And ultimately, we just it took us down a path of making sure that we can offload to multiple device types and kind of evaluate per use case. But there are certainly a lot of options, and per use case, you kind of have to really understand where you want to place your data for offload. Okay, I think that was the full set that were sent to me. Are there any other follow-ups or discussion points?
So I do have a question. So earlier on, you touched on briefly on alignment, data alignment.
Right. Yep.
So you do use RAID, for which you need to understand how your data is placed.
Right.
Can you elaborate on the DB page that you have to depend on in some way, and how the alignment or the complexity of the alignment that was a part of it?
Yeah, so it essentially boiled down to kind of multi-layers. So the parity scheme along with the ZFS record size is really where the alignment challenges came in, because if you have, actually, you know what, I might have a diagram in my backup slides to show this. Give me 1 second here. It'll be easier with a picture. Can you see this new slide?
No.
No.
Okay. All right, give me a second. That work? Okay. You're still not seeing it because I stopped sharing. This one. Is that showing up now?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
So the way ZFS divides its files up, it divides them up into records. Each record is individually spread across each disk drive. So in this case, we've got an 8+3. So really trying to co-design the ZFS records and the RAID configuration helped us with the alignment control. So we had to kind of mess with record size to try to understand the optimal placement. Oh, and this is not coming out through. But effectively, you end up with 1 megabyte per record, or per 1 megabyte per disk. And then we mapped our Parquet page. We mapped the Parquet data to be 1 megabyte as well. So that way, each disk had a LBA set that could read an entire indexed set of data. If that makes sense.
Yes, it looks like it's scaled for your model. Yeah.
Yep.
Thank you.
So I have a question.
Yes.
So was it processed in FPGA or DPU? It seems like because it needs a full integration of data. So I believe it should be processed in DPU, not any computational storage device.
Are you talking about the first use case I described?
I mean the erase coding. So
Okay.
the offloading, where did you process the offloading?
So in this case, in the on disk work, the file system itself does the erasure coding. So that's not offloaded. The CPU is doing that offloading as it normally would. The offload is on the query side, and that's done on each device. Each hard drive has its own.
Oh.
Yep.
And then can you move back to slide number 10?
Slide number 10.
Yes.
Yep.
So here I see several processes in NVMe IO accelerator. So I believe it could be a DPU or a CSD. So
right. So you probably don't want to do this on the CSD. Maybe a checksum, but the compression and the RAID Z you certainly want to do at a higher level. So something like a CSP/DPU is the correct place to do that. And it turns out that's where all of these operations were done. We're on CSPs.
Oh, I see. Thank you.
Yep.
So sorry, I have another question. So how much drives connects to a CSP device? I mean, can offload, handle the offloads?
So it really boils down to how many compression cores you can fit on a device. In the ABOF 1.0 implementation, I believe we had a single Xilinx U50 that was doing compression, and then we had 2 U.2 form factor CSAs or CSPs that were doing the other work, and the CPU can help there as well.
I see. So the U.2 form factor is basically it's a
FPGA.
FPGA inside without the media, right?
Correct. Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
And then there were 20 drives that were connected to those 3 accelerators.
20 drives per CSD, or
20 drives for those 3 accelerators I described. So
I see.
Yep.
Okay. Any requirements for the KV form factors? I mean, standards or?
Yeah, certainly just the standard. It seems like E3S is becoming the most popular form factor for the future. I don't think LANL has a strong preference. I will say our KV work was done using a E1L device. I think that was just because that was the zone namespace drive that was available. But in terms of form factor, I am pretty agnostic to form factor.
I see. That's about the hardware. But what I'm interested into the KV itself. Do we have any requirements for the KV systems, file or whatever standards?
Oh, I'm not sure I'm understanding your question. I'm sorry.
So for regarding to KV, there's a different structure of the KV that we can do. is there any standard behind that we need to follow?
So I think maybe what would be most useful is if I share that API we developed, so that way you can see what features we need, and then maybe you can build off from there.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Okay.
Cool.
Yes, I have another question about the key value API. So as you may know, in SNIA,
Right.
with the TWG, we have a key value API. So, did you use that any part of a key value API in your key value, ordered key value SSD or storage?
Yeah, so we started with the standard, but for our use case, we needed to expand it a little bit. So some specialized functions were developed, and that's that document I'm referring to that I can share with you of kind of the most important functions we felt were needed for our use case. And some of them were covered by the SNIA KV API, some of them were not.
Other questions for Dominic?
Yeah, I guess I'll close with, we are always open to collaborations and partners. So if anyone sees a flaw in something we've done or wants to chat more, I'm happy to do so. It was certainly a lot of material in a short time, so I certainly have hours worth of content that we can talk through.
Well, thank you very much, Dominic. We really appreciate your time and effort to put this together and present to us today.
Yep, thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.